When people think of the most powerful and dangerous crime families of all time, their minds immediately go to the Italian Mafia. This group has been around since the 1800s, and they have managed to remain one of the most feared groups in the world for decades. Even though they've had some huge hits, including the Godfather movie series and the TV show The Sopranos, most people still do and know about the real Mafia and what they have really done over the years. Let us take a look at one of the worst things they've ever done that shows just how far they were willing to go. Many of their members were also Italian citizens, and they were being forced into Mussolini's army. But as time went on, the plans became more ambitious. They figured that if Mussolini was bad enough that his own people wanted to get rid of him, then maybe they could do the same thing and set up a criminal state of their own. They were able to go back to their normal lives and start making money the old-fashioned way. But this didn't last for long. Soon the Americans were in control of Italy, and they were unhappy about what the Mafia had been doing during the war. They had been working with Mussolini and helping him carry out his plans, and now they were going to pay the price. Luciano had been a major player in the American Mafia for decades, and his arrest sent shockwaves throughout the organization. They launched a massive attack on the New York City Police Department. They moved their families out of the city, set up checkpoints around the city, and formed special units to hunt down the mobsters. It was a war zone, and no one was safe. Eventually, though, the police began to win. They started rounding up the mobsters and bringing them to justice. But this only made the situation worse. Bombs were detonated at police headquarters, several cops were murdered, and entire precincts were blockaded by armed mobsters. In the end, 5 of the 6 men were convicted and sentenced to prison. This was a major victory for law enforcement, but it also made the Mafia even more dangerous. The goal was simple: kill as many cops as possible and make the streets of New York too dangerous for law enforcement. They had been humiliated in court and they wanted revenge. In 1957, the U.S. government made a major breakthrough in the case when they arrested a Mafia turncoat named Joseph Velassi. Velassi had been a member of the Bonanno crime family for years, but he turned against his fellow mobsters. After he was arrested for burglary, he was giving the feds information that they needed to take down the rest of the Mafia. Over the next few years, the Mafia launched a series of attacks against the police and government officials. Bombs exploded, murders were committed, and entire families were put in the hospital. It was a reign of terror, and it seemed like nothing could stop it. His fellow mobsters were furious and they wanted revenge. They knew that if Luciano stayed in jail, he would eventually become an informant. These men were some of the most powerful mobsters in America, and their arrests sent shockwaves throughout the criminal underworld. This was the end of the Mafia's reign of terror, and it marked a new era in the war on crime. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the thumbs up button. It would be much appreciated. Thank you again for watching, and we will see you next time. To make matters worse, the U.S. government decided to prosecute them in a civilian court. This was unprecedented. No mobster had ever been tried in civilian court before. Everyone was wondering what would happen next. And rats, a term used to describe criminals who cooperate with the police, were looked down upon in the Mafia. Of course, this was just a fantasy. In reality, the Mafia was only interested in making money, and they didn't want to risk going to war or getting involved in politics. But it was still fun to dream about what could have been. Entire squads of Mafia soldiers would break out of their camps and head straight for the nearest major city. From there, they would lay low for a while until things settled down, and then they would go back to their old lives as criminals. They fought back with everything they had, which meant innocent people got hurt. Shops were destroyed, cars were blown up, and families were torn apart. It was a nightmare scenario, and it seemed like things couldn't get much worse. This meant they had to leave their criminal activities behind and become loyal soldiers. Of course, this didn't work out very well. Most Mafia members hated being in the army, and they couldn't stand the idea of fighting for a government that was corrupt and didn't care about its citizens. They figured that this would scare the rest of the mobsters and make them less likely to fight back. But this was another mistake. The Mafia wasn't like other criminal organizations. They were willing to do whatever it took to protect their own, and that included taking down the U.S. government itself. So they started planning ways to escape and get back to their old lives. They killed the judge and his family, then escaped before the police arrived. This event became known as the Mafia War. It was one of the deadliest conflicts between organized crime and law enforcement in U.S. history. In the early 1900s, Italy was going through some hard times. It recently lost a war with Ethiopia, and many people were leaving the country to try to make it in the United States. There was so much poverty that even former Prime Minister Antonio Salandra said there was enough food to feed everyone in the country. In fact, he said there were so many poor people that if they all worked together, they could have easily brought down the entire Italian economy. But no one listened, and everything went from bad to worse. In 1922, a man named Benito Mussolini took control of the government and created a fascist state. This made things even worse for the average citizen, because now they had to listen to a dictator. One of the worst things Mussolini did was force thousands of men into military service. He told them that he needed a strong army to help bring back the glory days of the Roman Empire. The truth was that he just wanted to keep his power and use brute force to put down any rebellions.
Guys.
As you can imagine, this caused a lot of problems for the Mafia. At first, the escape attempts were small-scale, with individual mobsters sneaking out of their camps and returning home. This went on for several years until Mussolini was finally overthrown in 1943. After this happened, the Mafia saw an opportunity to take control of Italy for themselves. With Mussolini out of the way, the Mafia had nothing to worry about. The Americans started arresting top Mafia leaders and putting them on trial for war crimes. In 1947, a group of Mafia hitmen snuck into the house of a federal judge who was about to sentence one of their own. It started with the arrest of Mafia boss Charles "Lucky" Luciano on various charges related to racketeering, gambling, and narcotics trafficking. So in July of 1946, the mobsters made their move, but the cops were prepared. They had been expecting something like this to happen ever since Luciano was arrested, so they had spent months planning their defense. For weeks, the battle raged on. Bombs exploded, gunfights broke out, and entire families were wiped out. Now that the police were winning, the mobsters had nothing to lose. Then suddenly they did. In September 1946, a grand jury indicted 6 Mafia bosses for murder and conspiracy. The trials dragged on for months, and the mobsters' lawyers tried everything they could to get the charges dropped. But it didn't work. Now the mobsters had something to prove. Then suddenly it did. With Valak's help, the government was able to arrest hundreds of mobsters and break up their operations. That is where we will end today's episode. But before we go, I would like to thank you for watching.